Are you ready to level up your coding skills by creating something that's never existed before, utilizing both front-end and back-end state-of-the-art technology? In this video, we're going to be creating a real-world application and unraveling the magic of full-stack development. So if you're ready to build an application using React and FastAPI, then let's dive into this video together. All right, so in this application, we are going to be building a React and FastAPI application. So React on our front end and FastAPI for our back end. So the very first thing we need to do is let's go ahead and just create two directories. So one we're going to name React, and the other one we are going to name FastAPI. Now, as always, let's open up a new terminal and make sure you're in our FastAPI React app. And the very first thing we're going to do here is create a siloed environment, so a virtual environment for our Python code in our FastAPI application. So let's start by saying Python 3-m venv to create the virtual environment for this project. Let's then go ahead and say source bin /env /bin/activate. This will activate our virtual environment. And now inside here, we want to say pip install FastAPI, Unicorn, and SQLAlchemy. We want to make sure that we install FastAPI, Unicorn, and SQLAlchemy because those are the three dependencies we need for this application. So after that, let's go inside our FastAPI directory and let's right click and say new file. Here, we're going to create a main.py file. We are going to create a database.py file. And we're going to be creating a models.py file. Now, our models are going to be the table for our SQLite application. So we're going to be using SQLite as our relational database. Our database is going to be the connection port from our SQLite application to our FastAPI application. And then our main.py file is going to be like the bread and butter of our FastAPI application. So let's start by going into our database and let's say from SQLAlchemy, we want to import our create engine. We want to say from SQLAlchemy.orm, we want to import our session maker. And then we want to say from SQLAlchemy.ext.declarative, import our declarative base. All right, now after this, let's go ahead and just say URL_database. And now this is going to be the string for our SQLite database. Now, if you want to use Postgres database or a MySQL database or even a MongoDB NoSQL database, go ahead and check out one of these videos. But for the meantime, for this application, we are going to be using SQLite. And to connect to a SQLite database, we're just going to say SQLite : /// and here I'm just going to name this our finance DB. All right, and now let's go ahead and just say engine equals our create engine. And inside here, we need to pass in our URL database. And then we want to say connect arguments. And we need this done object. And we're going to say check same thread as false. We then need to create our session local, which is going to be equal to our session maker, where we pass in auto commit is equal to false, auto flush is equal to false, and bind equals our engine that we just created. And then lastly, we want to say our base is equal to our declarative base. All right, so this is everything we need to connect our FastAPI application to our SQLite database. Now, the next thing we want to do is hop into our models, where now we're going to be creating our table for our SQLite database. So we want to say from database, we need to import our base. We want to say from SQLAlchemy, we want to import column, integer, string, Boolean, and float. So the column means in our database, we're going to be creating columns for the tables. And then the integer, string, Boolean, and float are the data types for each column. So now we need to go ahead and create our model. So we're going to call this model a class transaction, where we inherit our base that we created from our database, and we want to name the table. So we can say underscore underscore table name equals, and we're going to name this table transactions. So the underscore underscore table name underscore underscore for SQLAlchemy, it'll now create a table in the SQLite database called transactions. And now we're about to create the columns and the data types for each record in the table transactions. So here we want to create a new ID of column, which is going to be an integer. It's going to be the primary key. So we can say primary key equals true. And then we want this to be indexable, which means it performs a little bit better in the database. We want to create an amount, which is going to be a column of float. We want a category, which is going to be equal to a column of string. We want a description, which is going to be equal to a column also of string. Is income, so we'll be able to say like, is this income coming in? Is this a true or false? So we can say Boolean. So we can say column of Boolean. And then lastly, we're going to say date, but we're just going to have the date as a type of string. So we can say date equals column of string. So we can say date equals column of string, so we don't have to deal with any kind of date formatting between our JavaScript, React application, our Python FastAPI application, and then our SQL database. So all three of those could handle dates differently. So we're just going to say it as a string, so it's a smooth process and a smooth flow from the front end all the way to the database. All right, so now that we got our models, our database, let's go ahead and just jump into our main.py FastAPI application. So let's go ahead and say from FastAPI, we want to import our FastAPI. We want to import our HTTP exception and our depends. We then want to say from typing, let's import our annotated. We want to say from SQLAlchemy.orm. We want to import our session from our database. We want to say from Pydantic for our data validation. Import base model from our database. Import our session local and our database engine. And then we want to say import models. Okay. And now one more thing that we're going to run into is something called cores. And cores is a way for our application to automatically defend against cross-origin requests. And that means something other than the application is calling the application. And since our React application is going to be a completely different application than our FastAPI application, we need to enable cores. And we can enable cores by saying from FastAPI.middleware.cores, import our cores middleware. All right, and now as always, we want to say app equals FastAPI. And then we want to implement our cores origins. So our React application is going to be sitting on our local host of port 3000. So what we want to say is we want to create a new variable of origins, which is equal to a list because we can add more than one origin. And we want to say that this origin is going to be http://localhost of port 3000. So what this really means is a port or a different application is allowed to call our FastAPI application only if it is running on our local host on port 3000. So then we can say app.addMiddleware, where we can pass in our cores middleware, and we want to allow origins that is equal to our origins that we just created. So we have our origins list where we're only allowing one URL, and then we're adding it to our application. All right, so now let's go ahead and let's create our Pydantic. And we can do this by saying class transaction base. And we want to pass in our base model from Pydantic, where we're going to pass in our amount of type float, our category of type string, and we don't need this comma. Description of type string is income of type Boolean and date of type string. So right here, we're creating our Pydantic model, which is going to validate the requests from our React application. And based on if the data is valid or not, we'll either accept it into our FastAPI application or we'll reject the request from our React application. Let's also create one more, which is going to be our transaction model, which also takes in our transaction base, where our ID is going to be of type int, and then our class config is going to be ORM mode equals true. All right, perfect. We now need to create our database dependency. So we can say def get underscore DB, where we say DB is equal to our session local. We want to try and yield our DB. And then always make sure that we close our DB at the end. So right here, we're saying get DB, which is going to be our dependency injection for our application, which says we're going to try and create a database connection. And if we don't create our database connection, well, we're still going to close the database. And if we do, we're also going to close it. So we always want to make sure that our connection string only opens up when a request comes in, and then we close it when a request is complete. Okay. And now what we want to do is say DB dependency. So we're going to create our dependency injection right here equals annotated, where we pass in our session, and then we say depends, where we pass in our get DB. We then want to say models dot base dot metadata dot create all, where we pass in our bind that is equal to our engine. So what we're saying here is we are creating our database, and our database is going to create our table and our columns automatically when this FastAPI application is created. All right, so now let's go ahead and create our first endpoint for our transactions application. We can do this by saying @app.post, and inside here we want to say /transactions, and we can verify it by saying our response model should be equal to our transaction model. I'm going to make a space right there, and let's go ahead and say async def create transaction, where we pass in a transaction of type transaction base with our DB of DB dependency. And then let's go ahead and say DB transaction equals a new transaction from our models. So models.transaction. And inside here, we can say transaction.dictionary. And what this will do is, based on everything in our transaction base, we're going to map all of the variables from our transaction base to our table transaction to save into our SQLite database. We then want to say db.add and add our db transaction, db.commit, db.refresh, so we can get this db transaction back into us so we can now use the new one, and we can return this db transaction. So with that, let's go ahead and just run our application, because now we have our SQLite installed, our database connection installed, and we now have a full functioning API endpoint. Now to run this application, we need to jump into our FastAPI directory. So let's first go into cd/FastAPI, and now let's go ahead and say uvicorn main :app -- reload. All right, so here we can see our transaction API endpoint. If we open this up, we can try it out. We can say amount of 100. The category is learning. Our description will be online course. Income, we'll say false, and we'll say a date in the future. So we'll say like 2030, 10/04, and then execute. When When we scroll down, we can see that we get a response of 200 and we saved something to our database. Awesome stuff. If we go back to our application, we can see that there's a new file called finance.db. And that is our SQLite database. Our SQLite database is a file structured database that sits within the application. So it's not external like Postgres or MySQL. It sits within the application. So right here, this is our database. So to show you that we can retrieve data from the database, let's go ahead and just create a new Get API endpoint. We can do this by saying @app.get, and inside here, let's call this transactions as well, where we want this response model to be a list of transaction models. And up here in the top, we need to make sure that we import list. So we can say annotated and list. And now that will remove the error that we were getting right here with list. And now let's go ahead and just say async def. We want to read our transactions. We're going to pass in our DB of DB dependency. We're going to pass in our skip of integer equals 0. And then we're going to pass in limit of type int, which is equal to 100. So here we're adding some query parameters that will allow us to be able to fetch a certain amount of transactions for our application. All right, so far we are doing awesome. Let's go ahead and now say transactions equals db.query, where we pass in a transaction from our models dot offset. And here we're going to pass in our skip dot limit, and here we're going to pass in our limit dot all. And then let's go ahead and just return the transactions. So now if we go back to our application and we refresh, we can see that we're going to have another API endpoint called transactions, where we can try it out and we'll just pass in 0 and we'll say 100 is the limit for this API request. And when we click execute, we can now see a list of all of our expenses, which we only have one so far. So just moving right along, we have created our FastAPI application, which now shows everything from our database. Well, now let's go ahead and jump into our React application. For our React application, we want to use a different terminal. So let's go ahead and say new terminal. And the reason being is it's going to be sitting on a different port. So we want one terminal to handle our FastAPI application that is going to be running. And now on the other terminal, we're going to be using our React. So let's go ahead and just cd and do our React directory. And now to be able to use React, we need to go ahead and install Node.js. So if you've never used Node.js before, you need to go to nodejs.org/en and download your respective Node.js version. And I'm using this one right now, which is recommended for most users, but make sure you download Node.js because React will rely on it. Now, once you download Node.js, we'll be able to say npx create React app, and we'll name this our finance app. And now click enter. This will create a new app in our directory called finance app. And this is a React application, and you need Node.js because npx is part of the Node.js, and it's now downloading all the dependencies we need for a React application automatically right in our directory. And then from here, we can customize it now to fit our application needs. All right, so the next thing we need to do is get Bootstrap 5 in our application. Bootstrap is a popular CSS and JavaScript library/framework that comes with a lot of JavaScript and CSS automatically. So it'll save us so much time in making our application look elegant and modern and everything. So the very first thing we want to do is right here, it's going to give us a CSS, some JavaScript links that we need to add in our application, and it'll give us a starting template. Now, right here where it says Bootstrap CSS, we want to make sure we copy this entire line. Now, Now make sure you copy the entire line. This line is long. So let's go ahead and copy this. Let's go back to our Visual Studio, and inside our React application, let's go to public index.html. Now this is kind of like the entire beginning header and body and ending of a React application. So right under this meta and before this first link, let's go ahead and just paste in that CSS bootstrap that we just grabbed from the website. So now let's go back, and this option 1 bootstrap bundle with popper, let's go ahead and grab this entire thing as well. And now let's go back to our Visual Studio. Now let's scroll all the way down to where you see body. And right before this second body, which is a /body/, let's go ahead and paste that bootstrap bundle with popper link. Now this is all we need to set up Bootstrap 5, CSS, and JavaScript within our application. So we'll be able to add some animations and JavaScript and CSS all super easy. There'll be so much defined CSS already, which will just save us so much time with implementation. Now I'm not going to dive too much into everything React, but let's go ahead and just open up our source directory. Now our source directory is where all of our CSS and now the source directory is where all of our code is going to go. So if we open up our app.js, we can see that there's already some code here. And now app.js is our main React file that we're going to be working in this project. So we can see that when you install a React application, there's already some React that comes automatically pre-built with the app. So if we go back to our terminal, and right here we say npm start, which is our node package manager, and then we call the start, and that's coming from our package JSON, where we can see that there are some scripts inside, and that we are able to call these scripts by saying npm, and then it's calling the start functionality, which kicks off a React script start, and it's kind of like a flow of getting the application started. So if we click this, and we're getting an error because I actually have to jump in one level deeper, so it's inside our finance app. So let's go cd into our finance app from our React directory. So there's a React directory and then our finance app directory, and then this. So we can now say npm start here. And boom, we can see that just like that, we now have our React application running. And it's running on our port 3000. Our FastAPI runs on port 8000. And this 127.0.0.1 is your localhost. So I can actually change that to localhost, and it's going to show the exact same thing. So our React application is running on port 3000 of our local machine, and our FastAPI application is running on port 8000. Now this spinning logo and this edit source app.js to save and reload, learn React, all comes automatically from React. And that is the exact same thing as inside our source directory, our app.js file. So to show that, if we delete everything but this div, and I'm also going to delete this class name, so we just have all of this code, and then we have this div, and we say an h1 tag by doing caret h1, our end caret. Visual Studio will automatically create the ending caret. And here, if we just say hello and we save, it's going to automatically recompile. So now if we go back to our Chrome, we can see hello in the top left-hand corner. Pretty cool. So the next thing we need to do here is now create a React piece of code that'll send API endpoints and be able to communicate with our FastAPI application. Now, like I said, this is not like a super introductory to React because we are going to be calling API endpoints to our FastAPI application. But what we can do here is I'm going to delete everything right here where it talks about function app. And what I'm going to say first is right here where it says import logo and import our app.css. I am going to remove all of this. So all that we see right here is our export default app. I am also inside our source directory, going to right click, new file. And here I'm going to say API.js. Now inside our API.js, we need to go ahead and add our connection to our FastAPI application. But before that, we need to first download a new dependency. So we can say npm, so node package manager, install Axios. Now, Axios is a popular API connection library, so we can connect our React application to our FastAPI application. So now that we installed that, we can close out of this terminal for right now, and we can say import Axios from Axios. We then want to say const API equals Axios dot create. And now inside here, we want to say base URL colon http colon / localhost port 8000. And then we want to say export default API. So what we're saying right here is we know our FastAPI application is going to be at our port of 8000. So we're creating a base URL of http colon / localhost port 8000. So now in our app.js, we can call our FastAPI application pretty easily using a static string of base URL, so we don't have to recreate this every time or use these Axios creates. It'll automatically do all of that for us. So all we have to focus on is calling the right API for our FastAPI application. All right, so now from here, we can say import React, and then we want to say comma brackets, where we say use state, use effect from React. And to import React, that comes with a lot of just global dependencies. And then use state and use effect are hooks. They're called React hooks, and they're used for us to be able to call these API endpoints. All right, and now we can say import API from /./API. And you might be wondering, why is this a double quote and why is this a single quote? Well, that's just personal preference. So we can actually make this a single quote as well. All right, now let's go ahead and create our app.js, our React application for our FastAPI application. So what we can do here is we can say const app equals parentheses, arrow function brackets, where we can say const, and we're going to create pieces of state here, where we say transactions, set transactions equals use state, where we're going to say brackets with a list inside, and then const brackets form data, comma, set form data equals use state, where inside here we want to say parentheses brackets, and we want to say amount is going to be equal to an empty string, category is going to be equal to an empty string, description is going to be equal to an empty string, is income is going to start off as false, and date is going to be just an empty string, because remember, we're using a string for date, not anything else. All right. Now the next thing we want to say is we want to create some functions within our app.js file. So we can say const fetch transactions, which is equal to async parentheses arrow function brackets. And now inside here, we can say our response is going to be equal to await, and then API, which is our API that comes with all of our Axios stuff, dot get, where we can pass in our transactions endpoint, where I'm going to say /transactions/ and then we want to set it to our piece of state. So set transactions to our response.data. We then want to have a use effect, which is going to have a parentheses and then a set of parentheses inside with an arrow function brackets, which is our fetch transactions, with nothing at the end to re-kick off a new use effect hook. So we're using two hooks here. We're using our use state and our use effect. Use state allows us to keep state within React, so we know when state changes, so we know when to shift and change pieces of data. And then our use effect, which means when this component loads, which is our app.js, we are going to fetch our fetch transactions, which gets all of our transactions from our FastAPI application. All right, now let's go ahead and now create our handle input change. So we want to say const handle input change, which equals a new event on the screen with an arrow function brackets, where we can say our value. So const value is going to be equal to an event dot target dot type 3 equal signs dot checkbox question mark event dot target dot checked event dot target dot value. So we're creating a new function of const handle input change where we're expecting an event, and then we're creating a new variable based on the event of a checkbox getting clicked or not. And the checkbox is going to be the Boolean for our is income for our form that we're going to be working on here in a little bit. And then we can just say set form data to a set of parentheses with a bracket inside, where we can use ... form data. All right, and then once we get this form data, let's go ahead and just say event dot target dot name colon value, and let's add semicolons at the end of line 28 and 29. All right, and now let's go ahead and create one more handle form submit, and this is going to be the way that we can submit a form. And we can create this function by saying const handle form submit equals async, where we can pass in the event arrow function brackets, and here we want to say event.prevent default. And what this will do is when we submit a form, the normal event is to submit the form. We're going to say we don't want that to do. We do not want that to happen. So we're going to prevent it from defaulting to submitting the form because we want to handle the action of submitting the form. So here we want to say await.api, which is our FastAPI URL, where we're going to create a post call to our transactions, comma, form data. We then want to fetch our transaction. So if we add a new transaction, we want to refetch all the transactions. So when we show a table of all the transactions, we can see all of them there. So every time we submit a new transaction, we're going to recall all the transactions from the database, so the application is always up to date on the front end side. So we want to then fetch all of the transactions, and then we want to set the form data. So kind of like we did up here, we can grab all of this because that's setting the state. We want to then say set form data to all of this, and then close out of these. So these are the pieces of state. So we're going to have a form where we can type in the transaction date. And once a user fills all those form fields up, those input forms, and they click submit, well, all of those will still stay with data. So if you type in 100 and then you click submit, it'll still say 100. And that's because we're preventing the default action of removing all of that, because we're overriding the form submission with our fetch and submit APIs. Well, what we need to do then, because they're pieces of state on the React application, we need to set the amount, category, description, is data, and default is income and date back to the original pieces of state, which is just empty strings. All right, so now let's start writing some actual HTML code to show our application is doing something, right? So the first thing that we have to do is create a return statement. So we can say return parentheses. Now, one thing to note is React can only return one element. So for example, if we're outside this div and we say we want to return to H1, well, we're going to get an error because it can only return one thing that we need as the parent. And that's okay. We'll just use a div as the parent. Well, the very first thing we're going to do is create a nav bar. So let's go ahead and just say _nav. And inside here, we're going to say class name equals navbar dash dark, and then bg primary. Inside here, let's create another div where this class name is going to be equal to container dash fluid, and the CSS. Now this CSS is all from Bootstrap. So if you have any questions about what this is doing, feel free to look it up on Bootstrap. This is Bootstrap 5, and in React, these are called class names, not just class. All right, and then inside here, we are going to create an A tag where this has a class name that is going to be equal to our navbar dash brand. We want an href that really is not doing anything, so we'll just have it set to a default pound. And then outside of this, we want this to say our finance app. All right, let's open this up and let's type in npm start. This will actually fetch our API endpoints and stuff, but we're not currently using that anywhere. So let's just open up our browser. Okay, so we're getting an error. If we right click and we just go over and we re-click this and we go to console, we'll be able to see what's going on. So we're getting an HTTP error from a bad request to our FastAPI application. So it's saying localhost 8000/transaction is not allowed. So let's go back to our API and see what could be the issue here. Well, it looks like this is only a slash. So if we go back into our FastAPI application and we look at our main.py and our main.py file, we can see that we have our slash transactions as just one slash and no slash at the end. Let's just add another slash here at the end, just so it matches perfectly with our API endpoint that our request is calling on our React application. So now if we go back to our Google Chrome, now if we go back to our browser and go back to our React app and we refresh, we can see that we just fixed the API endpoint error, and we now have a beautiful nav bar at the top of our screen where we can shrink it and make it bigger, and it says finance app, all using React. Okay, and now let's go back into our Visual Studio. Let's get out of our FastAPI application. And let's go back to our code here for React. So let's jump out of this nav. So this is going to be our nav right here. Let's now go ahead and say div. And this div is going to have a class name that is equal to container. Inside this div, we want to create a form where this form has an onSubmit event call that is going to be equal to our handle form submit function. And now inside this form, we want to create another div where this div is going to have a class name that is equal to MB-3 and MT-3, which means margin bottom 3 and margin top 3. So we're going to make some space between the nav bar and the beginning of our form. We then want to have a label And our label is going to have a HTML4. And we're going to say for amount. Our class name is going to have a form : or dash label. And we are going to say this is for amount. So if we save this and we go back into our browser, we can see that we now have a label of amount, which has a margin from the top of the nav bar. And now we need to have an input inside the same div. And this is where a user will be able to type in something. So we can say input, and here we actually just want it to be just a open caret input. And then on the same line, we're gonna say slash caret, where we can say type equals text, because we want a user to be able to type in text. Class name is going to be equal to form control. ID is going to be equal to amount. Name is going to be equal to amount. We can say on change is going to be equal to our handle input change. And then value will equal our form data dot amount. All right, so if we save this now and we go back to our browser, we can see that there is now a input field under our amount where a user can type stuff in. All right, now for this div, let's go ahead and just copy this a few more times. So I'm going to make some spaces just so it's easier to see. But I'm going to do another div here where we're going to remove this margin top. So it's only going to be margin bottom, because the margin bottom of this will push the next input down. And this will be for category, not for amount. It's going to be a form label. We want this to now say category. We want it to be of type text. We want it to be a form control. This is going to be for category. The name is category. And form data dot category. We now want to do the exact same thing for our description. We can say for description. We want it to be text. For description. I'm just going to copy and paste this. Whoa. I'm going to copy and paste this in here. And it's going to be for our form data of description. Let's now do it for our checkbox. So we can say div class name of MB3. This is going to have a label for is income with a form label where we'll say income ? And now our input for this is going to be of type checkbox. Class name is going to be form control. We do not need a class name for our checkbox. Our ID is going to be is income. Our name is going to be is income. We want our on change to be the handle input change, where our form data is going to be dot is income. And then lastly, let's do it one more time. And this will be for our date. So we'll do it just as it was for the other strings, where it's going to be date. This will be date. Type text, form control, ID is date, description name is date, and then form data is date. All right, and then right before the end of our form, we want to create a button. So we can say caret button, where type is equal to submit, and our class name is going to be button dash primary, and we'll just name this button submit. So now if we go back to our browser, we're going to see that there is an entire form, and we'll be able to type into it. So we can say 50, category is React, description, learning React. We'll say it's false, and we'll also say it's in the future. So we'll say 2030-07-09. When we click submit, we will get an error for right now. And if we look at our console, we can see that it's having an issue calling our localhost 8000 due to CORS. Well, if we remember, we thought we did cores earlier. If we go into here and we look up our FastAPI application and we look into our main, we can see that we do have http://3000 allowed. So I'm going to change those single quotes to double quotes, and then I'm going to add a comma. All right, so right here in our cores middleware, we also need to go ahead and add allow_credentials, which we're going to make equal to true. We are going to say allow_methods, which is going to be equal to an array of strings, which we're going to say star, so that'll accept everything. And then we want to say allow_headers, which is going to be equal to an array of also stars. Allow methods equals a string of stars, and allow_headers equals a list of stars. All right, so now if we go back to our browser and we refresh our screen, let's see if it gets submitted. So we can say amount is equal to 1000, category is React, description is React Learning, and for the date, we'll say it's in the future of 2030, April 5th. If we click submit, it just goes away and all of the fields are empty and our submission worked. If we go back to our code, we can see that we had a successful post request and a successful GET request from our FastAPI application. So it is working, we just are not currently showing any of the transactions. So let's hop back into our app.js and let's write the last bit of code we need to show all of the transactions for this application. So right under this form, let's go ahead and create a table. Now, this table is going to show us all of our transactions that we've built so far. So let's get a table class name is going to be equal to table striped, table dash bordered, and table slash hover. Let's create a T head, and inside here, let's create a table row. And now we're going to create a couple table headers where this is going to say amount. This is going to say category. This is going to say description. This one's going to say income ? And this one's going to say date. And let's remove this random slash up here. Oops. There we go. All right, and now right under our table header, let's create a table body where we're just going to show all of our transactions. So we're already fetching all of them from FastAPI. We can now say brackets transactions.map, where we can say parentheses with another set of parentheses inside, where we can say transaction, arrow function, more parentheses, open that up, and inside here, let's create a new table row for each transaction. So we can say right here, we want this key to equal a transaction.id. And what a key means in React is it's React's way of knowing that this transaction is different than any other transaction. So a lot of times you'll use a transaction ID as the key. Okay, and now let's go ahead and just create a couple table data, and that's each piece of data inside the table row, where we can say transaction amount. And I'm going to copy this for each item. So there's 5 items. So I'm just going to copy this 5 times, where it's .amount, .category, .description, .is income, and lastly, .is date. Now, the only difference is we don't want it to say true or false. We want it to say yes or no. So since is income is a Boolean, we can literally say space question mark yes or no. So this is a Boolean way of printing two different types of strings. So if is income is true, we'll print yes instead, and if it's false, we will say no. All right, so let's go ahead and save our application, and let's go back to our browser. And right here, we can see both of our transactions. We can see amount, category, description, income, and date. If we pass in a new item, so category, we'll say a puzzle for our brain. I don't know, it's part of our income. And we'll say 20900423, and we click submit. This is saved in our FastAPI database. So what we did was we called our FastAPI database with this information for a post request, and then we refetched all of the information from our FastAPI application. All right, so if you enjoyed this course, please like and comment below, and I'll see you in the next video.